Okay, let's share screen. Okay, I think we left off about number 15 on the assignment for unit 7, so we'll wrap that up. So as we were talking about different attacks, and when you gather DNS information, that's DNS stands for domain name system. That's a server that correlates public IP address to the domain name, which is what you see in URL, like Microsoft.com, Google.com, and so on. Every website that you see, every web server is connected to a DNS. And on the DNS, they would have records to be able to correlate the IP to the domain name. So now, why do they care about getting your DNS records or DNS service information? It is used to modify the records. So poisoning is one way that they can modify to forward your traffic to their domain. And also farming along with denial of service. So they can take down your DNS by just launching requests. And you can find this information on the notes as well. Okay, so it talks about different types of attacks. Now, in the ARP poisoning area, that's usually related to your address resolution protocol. And that's a little bit different where they can modify your address information or flood a certain switch. We touch on that. So on number 16, and we're covering unit 7, wrapping up the assignment. What is used in the DNS server to prevent DNS poisoning? So all you have to do is configure it to accommodate DNSSEC, which is domain name system security extension. This is an option in the configuration. It's a checkbox, right? So we'll do some DNS setup. And when you enable that, what that does is it's going to take the records and it's going to hash the records so that way it's not just viewable. So it protects the records and prevent the DNS poisoning attack. And that's how you can do it. Now the DNS, when you scan, right, we are going to look at a way to scan the DNS. You saw how we can enumerate the DNS using DNS enum. So when you scan the DNS, if it's protected, it won't allow you to view what that record is. Okay. Now on your Windows OS, like Windows 10 or Windows Server 2018, 2019 or 16, you can locate the host file information in the driver directory under etc. So, and when you take the CIS27A class in forensic, we will look at some of the files component and how we can identify certain files that's related to certain tasks for the user. So the host file is located in the subfolder, and we want to know where that is because Windows by default, if you don't store it anywhere else, it's going to put it in the drivers folder under system 32. Okay. And then we touch on what is used for the network time protocol application attack. We use network time for a lot of different things, from syncing database to making sure that systems are replicating. So when I'm saying replicating, meaning that I can have a domain and I can add a bunch of users. Let's say I have new employees, and once in a while, the corporate office has to replicate that to the branches in the subdomains, so that way those users can log into other locations, right? Whenever they're working remotely or even when they're visiting a certain branch. So now a way that they can do the NTP application attack is that they would use a monolith, which is a command. And this is what you would see in Linux system. Okay, and monolith, we can use it to send 600 host connection to the server, and that will overwhelm the servers. And so they would start with spoofing the IP so we cannot track them, and then send the command to flood the actual server, and that's how they would do that. Okay, and when we can't track IP, then we can go revert back, and if they're connected to our network, we can possibly find a switch table to find their MAC address. So they have to also spoof the MAC. And so spoofing is just a way to use, right, a different address, right, to impersonate someone else in the network. Now, when administrator needs to identify a malicious domain or a website, and these are often embedded with codes, right? It could be malware, it could be keyloggers or Trojans. The best way is to really look at the actual domain log files. So DNS log files is going to be important, because when the service is enabled, your system is designed to log everything from the time that it starts the service or even when we stop the service. So if your DNS starts a service, it generates a log, right? It's going to record all the actions that's happening within the DNS. So the best way for you to really look at possibly if your domain is being attacked, or they're using it to embed some kind of code, we can look at our log files, and we need to monitor traffic, and you can use sniffers, right, like Wireshark, to really look at your traffic. Okay, so you will also hear about replay attack. And what replay attack is that they can use it for wired and wireless. It doesn't necessarily be wireless. Wireless is more common. So they can scan your traffic using Wireshark or a sniffer tool. Then what will happen is they will capture the traffic information and take a look at the packet. So remember when we're using Wireshark, we open up a packet and we can see the details about the packet. So now all the protocols have inherent weaknesses, but we still use them because that's the way that it was created, and we transitioned to improve some of the protocols. So in a replay attack, they will capture your network traffic, and that's the first thing. They will listen for your traffic, and then they would take the capture and look at your packet. And what they can do is on the wireless side, they can modify the encryption looking at your initiation vector or the content of your packet. So some packet, the data is raw and you can actually see pieces of the data, right? So the way that the network works is like this. When you're sending a request, so let's say I'm connecting to google.com, right? And I'm submitting my search on google.com. Your data is not sequentially sent. That means that when your data is sent, right, the packets, they arrive at different times. The way that we design it is it's just first come, first serve. It's going to get passed to the domain or the destination server. When it gets there, because of TCP, it acknowledged the connection, then it's going to open up and reassemble everything. So, and it used a sequence number to really identify which pieces of the data goes first. So when you're downloading a movie or a file, right, from a server or a website, that's what happens. Your files don't come in one piece or sequential for that matter. So when I say sequential, that means that it's going to cut it up into 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, so many bytes, right? Depending on how large or small your file is. So when it gets served back to your system, when it comes back to your network, your files are not in order. When it gets to your system, it's going to use a sequence number to look at how the files needs to be arranged, and that's how it puts it back. Think of it like a bicycle, right? When you get pieces of the bicycle, your system is going to put everything in place, like the handlebar, the pedal, and then eventually you have a bicycle. And that is done in nanoseconds, so milliseconds. So so in the case where if they're looking at that, how can they modify your data? Well, some of the protocol, it shows the data in raw, right? And we would use a tool to be able to modify the packet. So in my Python classes, I actually show them that you can script to take a packet and modify and then change the header for the packet, and it reroute that packet to another server. So that's how they're able to do that, is to use scripting tools and be able to capture that, or they have like pre-made tool that has, like burp is another one that's very common. You can use it for different forms of attack and so on. Okay, so I'll show you how you can use some of the tools to really analyze things this week, along with how we can protect. Okay, so when we use Kane, right? Some of you were successfully using Kane. You are actually brute forcing your password. Okay, Kane is made for Windows, but you can use John the Ripper or burp to be able to brute force, or you can script it. In my CIS30C class last week, I showed them how they can brute force FTP using script, because most of these students are going to be pen testers and they want to know how to do that, right? So you can use it. So there are two types of passwords. There's one that's going to be online. Those are like your login to sites and certain accounts. So if I log into my Gmail account, that's an online account. Okay. And so when it's brute forcing that, it needs to just keep guessing the characters, right? When we can generate a word list to tell it to use that. And all it does is it's using a loop to enumerate through it and plug those things in. So now the brute force mechanism is only effective if your word list is long and effective. Okay. So when you're using Kane, because the equipped word list is fairly limited, so therefore it's only able to brute force like to a certain number of characters. Now, also depending on the number of cores, right, your processor, your connection to that system if you're doing remotely. So for the online account, they have to connect to a server, and that's usually via the internet or internet connection. And so now we can use account lockout to set lock. So if I make it where if they guess it 5 times, it's going to stop, right? It's going to lock them out for 24 hours. And this is what you see when you're paying your bill and you don't put in the right password. It's going to lock your account and you have to reset it. So now another way that they can also connect is when we're using SSH. Secure Shell allows us to directly connect to a server, an appliance like firewall, switch, router, etc. And SSH is normally used to log into authenticate, right? So now we can limit that number of authentication per connection. So I can say, okay, you can only connect 5 times from that source system, okay? And that's gonna limit it where that source system cannot brute force it so many times, because every time that it brute force, it needs to reconnect, okay? It needs to establish the connection. And if you do take 40A next semester, you will learn how to set up PuTTY with SSH with me and connect to the switch. So where you're going to use the switches on the racks and so on. So now if you're using complex and long passwords, all you're doing is buying time. Okay. In security, we're buying time. So what we can do with that time is important. We can check the logs. We can hopefully create alarm system to sound off so that we can stop the breach, right? Because once they enter using an authentication, they can take your data, they can corrupt your data, and data is money. Okay, we're going to talk about risk assessment this week. All right, 22. The methods that you use to reduce the risk for online and offline brute force, we need to make sure that we set up account lockout policy, password policy. That's really important. So account lockout, we talked about that. It's going to limit the attempts that they can use with different passwords. And then if you're using complex password, we can set up the policy. So when we say policy, those are just rules for the system to apply, okay? And in this world, that's what you do. You set up rules for your firewall to block things, to allow things. You set up rules for your server to accept or not accept certain things, and that's what you do. Okay. And you know, that can be a job for someone. So to look at policy and then audit accounts. That's what they do. Okay. Oh, up a little bit. Yeah, let me zoom out a little bit more. Okay, hold on 1 second. Okay, so we can use complex password. We touch on that, upper lowercase, at least 8 characters. So in the industry right now, we not only using password, we're using multi-factor authentication, but I read so many articles about how you can bypass multiple factor authentication, something you have like your smartphone with text, right, to verify who you are, something you know. So because they can actually impersonate that person using that number, and then, or even biometrics, right? People can actually create fake fingerprints and things like that. But what we're doing is when you're using the policy, if you're applying the effective policy, you can slow something down, okay? Now, in the password history policy, you want the user to not reuse the same password, because if they're reusing the same password, it can be easily guessed. Or if they're using a dictionary-based password, that's part of the complex password, things that are word-based, and they have tables that list in all different languages. So if someone say, oh, if I make this my password a common word in Spanish or French, they might not get it, right? It can be guessed in all different languages. And if you ever Google like the common dictionary password online, you would see tables and groups of passwords that people use. So we want to use complex password, at least 8 characters, upper lowercase numbers. We want to make sure we don't reuse the last 5 or few passwords. We want to make sure that we apply account lockout so it prevent brute force. Any question? And then ultimately you want to teach your users, right? Even at home, you want to talk to the people who are using the system and making sure that they're using good passwords. All passwords should be stored with encryption, and now you have tool, right? API tools, applications that store your password and pass it to another application. A lot of companies use single sign-on. So single sign-on is a way, including here at RCCD, right, to really give the user the convenience. But single sign-on, because it's passing the token, sometimes that can be a little risky if you don't know how to protect it. So with convenience, we waiver, right, some of the risks and some of the issues that's existing in our system. And technology, that's what you're going to get. Any question? 22? Uh-huh. 23 says, what older protocols are susceptible to pass the hash attack? And hash is just a numerical value that's generated from an algorithm. It could be various different types of algorithms. You might see MD5 hash that's commonly used with software. So there are many different types of hashes. We'll come back to encryption in the later chapter, and we'll talk about it a little bit more. So when you use brute force on Kane, right, you select LM and NTLM, right? Remember that in Windows system, it uses a hash key or a hash value to encrypt your passwords, right? Encryption sounds strong, but encryption is only as strong as its keys. So if you can guess the hash, you can open up the encryption. So in Windows environment, even on your Windows 10, and you saw it, some of you saw that, right? When you're using shorter password, Kane just gives it to you like that in less than 30 seconds. Now that's using a single core on a virtual machine that's limited, right? On a regular system, like your gaming system, it's a lot faster. So when you can see that the protocols, even though it's old and Microsoft said, oh, we're encrypting all our passwords, we're still vulnerable to brute force within the system, right? That's the weakness. So your NTLM and your LM, those are the protocols that's still being used today to encrypt your password in your Windows system. Okay. And if you do pursue, pen testing or ethical hacking down the line, you will see that you will have to, most of the system that you're going to work with are Windows based. So, if you have a lot of knowledge in window weaknesses, you can quickly find things very fast. Okay, you having a hard time seeing smaller? Yeah, 22. Yeah. That's okay. All right, so I'll scroll down so you can see and the rest of the people can see. So for 24, it asks you the method that reduces the risk in a rainbow attack. So rainbow attack, unlike your regular brute force uses maybe one or a couple of your word list. Rainbow, you can actually make a table where, and you can download these too, okay? Where it's gonna use that table to be able to generate your attack for a specific type of password. So again, just like brute force, we can make sure that our password is complex. Teach the user to use passphrase, right? At least 12 characters and up. And there are ways so we can salt the password. So salt is just a way that we stuff the password with various keys. And it's we salt the encryption for the password, but you can also stuff the password just to make it longer. Again, we're buying time, right? And then teach the user. And so in compliance for all companies, all organizations, whether it's public or private, you are required to do security training at least once a year. Some require more stringent awareness training, right? So each user has to be compliant with that, especially when you're working with like highly sensitive data and so on. And then for 25, it asks you what happens in the session hijack. So in a session hijack, what it does is it takes advantage of your web section. So when I make a purchase online, right, I use an HTTPS website. HTTPS uses SSL or TLS, which are the two protocols that you commonly see for web, right? And it uses stream-based encryption. That means that every bit that's sent through, it's gonna encrypt that, and it streams it because it's faster. Compared to blockchain, when you're looking at like crypto money and things like that, right? It does chunk encryption. So it takes a big chunk, right, of data and it pieces down to the smaller chunks and encrypts based on the algorithm. Then what it's gonna do is gonna pass each of the chunks. So in order to open, think of it like a train, right? You have car 1, car 2, car 3. So in order to encrypt the next one in the chain, I have to decrypt. And in order to decrypt the next one in the chain, I have to have the decryption for the first, and then it's going to activate the key and so on and so on. So blockchain is definitely slower. We don't want to use that for web services. So often you're going to see web services using stream-based. So in a session hijack, your session is created and it generates what's called a session ID. It's just a number that you use. And the ID is stored in a cookie. Okay. You ever visit sites that all the sites want you to store cookies? You know why? For marketing purposes. But when you're making purchases online or processing an online transaction, you generate the session ID and it stores it on the cookie. Whenever you click the button back on your browser, right, it stops that session because that ID is no longer valid. Now, not all organizations, they will do that. So your session ID can be found in a for the session hijack. And then I would take your ID and your cookies, I would poison your cookie, modify your cookie file, and I would take the ID and use it for me. So whatever that you process, as far as, let's say I transfer fund on my banking account, right? I can make it become my fund that way. I can capture that session and impersonate you, and then log in as you, and then move some money. Okay. So a lot of the times they do session hijacking with cross-site scripting and SQL injection. They normally use that because database is connected to web server, and web server is connected to the DNS. And so, you would see all the different type of attacks happening that way. Okay, any question? All right, so you can read the cookies for cross-site scripting, or you often see it as XSS. Okay, and that's how they're able to obtain your session ID. And then they would insert the ID into the HTTP header, and that can be done with Python scripting or JavaScript scripting. And then it just sends to the website. And that's the process in that. Okay. So if we understand the process, what will happen is you have to take a look at each of the steps on how you can prevent that. How do you protect your cookies? How do you make sure that they don't do cross-site scripting and capture your ID? How do you make sure that your HTTP server don't respond, right, to a certain request to give the header? Because all HTTP server, it's going to respond. It's going to say, oh, I'm going to serve you this. Did you ask for that? Okay, right? So what we can do is we can use the application firewall to make sure that only source and destination on a validated sequence to be able to make sure that that gets served, right? And it is harder to track, especially if you are an e-commerce site and so on. So you have to have a monitoring system in place and a filtering system in place. And then for 26, the technique that's used to prevent buffer overflow. So in development, buffer overflow just means that you need to store data that's more than what your storage is allowed. And when you are in the buffer, because on an application, it would use a certain amount of RAM. Okay. If you ever install software, it's going to tell you, oh, this is how much RAM you need. This is how much, the type of OS you need, right? So the application is designed to use a certain amount of storage. And when it exceeds that storage, right, it overflows that buffer, the buffer zone. So what will happen is in an attack, they would just make sure that your routines, right, is routines, subroutines are like functions, they're tasks. So it's just going to keep generating the same task over and over again until it overwhelms the system, because every time that function is called, it has to put it on a stack, which is a storage space. So as your stack grows, right, it's going to reach a ceiling. And when that ceiling is topped out, that means it's going to overflow that storage space. So in order to prevent that, you need to make sure that the development side needs to handle error, right? Error handling is very important. It can be done in the coding. And then input validation. So when I say input validation, what does that mean? You ever visit a site and it tells you you cannot use symbol for your password? You know why they're doing that? To prevent injection, right? Or validation could just be that, oh, you have to type a certain way, right? When I fill out my date of birth, it has to have the slashes, right? So they clean up the data that way, but also the attacker, if they see that you can put in anything in the form, they're gonna put in a whole script. Okay, so my camera system got hacked a while back, right? I had the night owl and I used the open DNS stuff. This is an old system that I had put on my house. Now I no longer use it, but I started sensing something. It started acting a little funny, so I took it down and I logged in and I looked. So they injected a script, and on that script, I could read it. I could see that it's trying to guess my passwords, right, to access the server. to get the content of my data, which are videos. Okay. So with that, if they actually manage the input validation, that script would not happen, right? So on the system side, on the development side, the interface for that, they can control that. Limit the number of characters that you can put in, right? You ever fill out a form and it tells you only 250 characters, right? Because some scripts are longer, or limit the symbols that you can use and so on. All right. So in security, we often would have to use things like programs and application, but we also have to work with developers. Okay. You also need to create a system, and sometimes you would see SDLC would refer to as security development lifecycle. It's not just for applications and software, but SDLC is often referred to as software development lifecycle. So there are two ways to really manage it. Number one is the waterfall way. So when I say waterfall, that means, you know, the water falls down and it ends up right on the basin or somewhere in a lake, whatever, right? So waterfall means you test things at the end. You will build everything out and test it at the end. Okay. Now the downside of that is when things go wrong, you don't know until the end. Okay. Now most companies now they use an agile model. So when you become an IT manager down the line, or you know, when you manage project, you're going to hear a lot of these. So agile is just a principle where you would do cross-functional teams and you test as you go. So that way you don't want to wait till the end in order to, you know, so you can share some of the function across the team. All right. Let's take a look at your, go to this site. And this is, you know, a way that we can check cookies. Okay. And then we are going to, put in youtube.com. Okay, so put in a URL and then you're going to scan. And it's going to tell you the type of cookies the site is asking for and how many cookies are used from that website. So what you can do is you can check certain sites, right, on what kind of cookies required and so on, because you saw earlier that cookie can be poisoned and cookie can be used in a session hijack. Okay. So I'm here. I can put in, let me see if it has to have the HTTPS. Yes, it does. So make sure when you put this in, you have to use the okay, so once you have the information, make sure you answer the questions. It will tell you how many cookies are used by the website. Can you delete your cookies? Sure, you can use your browser setting to delete your cookies every time you end the session. When you close out the browser, browser is just application. So that way the system it clears it out. Now in forensic, even when you do that, we can still find traces of it, right? So 27A addressed that on, you know, how do people really delete things and not be able to, you know, where can we find this type of information? So you can find a lot of the things on storage and RAM, and you can actually read RAM because everything goes to RAM first. So, okay. So here it will give you this, the analytics. So the type of cookies you would see on the left column, okay? And Google owns this, so they're gonna have something similar. Whenever they store your cookie, they always want some kind of consent. So now the duration. So this one is a session one, okay? So if you subscribe to YouTube and if you do like those YouTube TV or whatever, right? When you log in, like me uploading video for your class, that will be like your session, okay? And then it uses this one to refer to if you have visited their site before, right? That's for marketing purposes for most part, and so on. So your cookies are here. And then they use it for advertisement mostly, so it will say that there. Okay. And then how many cookies, you can count them up. Some websites use more or less, right? Depending on the type of site. So on YouTube, we can see 2, 4, 6. Yeah, so 6 different cookies that are, they're just files, right? And then the second one, we are going to do, we are going to go to the Knowledge Center. So I want to show you this because they give you information about cookie poisoning. I know the book talks briefly about it in the notes. Okay, so you can find a lot of things that would be Redware. They are a security consulting company, but you can find some research information that they've done here. Okay, so once we visit the site, it talks about what is cookie poisoning, how can an attacker perform cookie poisoning, and what is used to protect the web server. So if you go back here, it tells you here, what is cookie poisoning? It is a way to forge a cookie. And so because the browser keeps track of it, right? For the session, it's just a way to bypass security measures and so on. So you can take this information and put it down. The reason why I wanted to share this with you is most of you likely that you will come across this area, whether you're tracking internal employee or you're tracking external sources. So everybody uses web-based stuff nowadays. Okay. And then it tells you that it is easy to do because for the web application, there are certain parameters that you can use. And that way you can modify it from an attacker standpoint. So that's general information. You should be able to answer those 3 questions from there. And you're fine. You can take pieces and paste that down there. And it tells you, it asks you what is used to protect the web server from cookie poisoning. So it talks about here, it says a good web application firewall will protect against cookie poisoning and detecting the cookie set commands, because they have, in order to save or update that cookie information, they have to use the set function. So it would be giving you that. Okay. You can find the last answer there. Any question? All right, so if you finish with this, save it and then submit it for Unit 7. I did extend the due date. Some of you already turned it in. And then now we're going to cover Unit 8. So access Canvas and download Unit 8. So we're going to continue the discussion of threats, but in this one, we're going to talk a little bit about pen testing and vulnerabilities and assessment for risk. Let me close my Unit 7. Oh, I don't want that one. Okay. So let's define some of these things because you're going to need to know that for security class. So by definition, a risk is a likelihood that a threat will exploit the vulnerability. Okay. A threat is anything that can cause your system harm. So a malware is a threat. People are threats, right? Attackers are threats. So a threat could be anything that can potentially cause danger to a system from our perspective, right? A risk is a likelihood that a threat will exploit the vulnerability. So vulnerabilities are weaknesses in the system or software. For example, Windows OS, you saw that there's common vulnerabilities, right? So someone can take advantage of that vulnerability and perform a zero-day attack, and that will become a threat. And if it's likely to happen, then that will be a high risk. Okay. In our world, this is what we do. We analyze the risk and we come up with solutions to fix, to prevent. Okay. Yes. Oh, is it not? Let me see. This one?
Yeah.
Oh yeah, let me re-upload that. Sorry. I probably okay. Let me change that real quick. Oh, sorry. I might have done this. The assignment, the notes are okay. The assignment. 27. Hold on. Let me re-upload it. Okay, don't download it yet. Okay. Let me double check. Okay, it should be right now. Now you can re-download it. I modified since last year, so you probably have the older version from before. Okay, everybody okay with the assignment download? All right, so make sure that we understand the differences between a risk, a vulnerability, and a threat. You will see that on certification and also our exam. Okay, so how can we really determine the levels of impact? So when you deal with risk, you're gonna really assess the impact. We can measure it by qualifying it, which often that you see, if you see companies that say this is a low level risk, right? That's just a label of a category that we would use toward that risk. Is it a high risk, low risk, or medium risk, right? But when you quantify it, you can put a numerical value to it. And so we can quantify. So let's say that this risk is level 10. Okay. Then that will be a 0 or 1 through 10 from low to high, right? So you can use a numerical value to really measure the magnitude of the impact. So now, based on how often or how impactful that danger is to the organization. So it says that it can be qualified or quantified based on the magnitude of harm that can be caused if the threat exercises the vulnerability. Okay. And in the case of if you see something like WannaCry or some of the event that happened in the past where they take advantage of the vulnerability, WannaCry was a highly impacted risk because it's a common vulnerability in Windows for the operating system that's often used by 80% of the businesses out there. Now, there are different types of threats. You would have human threats, right? So the humans could be attackers, script kiddies, criminals, and the criminals could be people who are taking your identity or they're committing cybercrime. It could also be disgruntled employee, people who are angry because they didn't get raises, right? And you see this. So whenever we work with like the security people, like the physical security people, we often address the same thing, right? Humans can be threats because they might steal things, they might corrupt things. So in the system, script kiddies, right? Criminals, those are some example. Organized crime group, your APT, and so on. So internally, you might have people who are threats. So how can we reduce that, right? A lot of times we practice the screening of our employees, making sure that you check background, but that can only cover so much. Okay. Regular performance reviews, a lot of the things that we do for monitoring on our system to make sure that our users are not imposing any kind of risk. Yeah. Well, you also have privacy issues too, right? Some company, they would actually watch your web traffic by looking at evaluating your cookies and so on, depending on the policy. So, you know, how much can you actually look at things when people are using, you know, your system? Whenever companies give you laptops and things like that, they expect, right? You should expect that they could see everything that you do, okay? I was actually one of the administrators that assess cookies for people. So it notifies me like who's violating a policy and then I have to report it to the manager. So sometimes you would see that happening. And then you also have accidental threats. People who accidentally delete files, right? And there are ways that administrators can recover those files, right? Sometimes they delete and then empty the trash can, right? So you should have backup of their files to be able to pull that. They also give out personal identifiable information on email, and we can prevent that by content filtering on our email server. Things like social security, driver license, stuff like that, healthcare information. They can also tell someone over the phone or give out messages, text messages. So we can monitor a lot of the technical aspects. And for phone conversation, a lot of times company would do recordings, especially call center. But do they screen everything? Probably not. Okay. They also throw things in the trash, and dumpster diving is a big area. We know that. So shred documents and making sure that documents are properly destroyed. Nowadays, you can eliminate a lot of the printing process, but there are companies that require printing, right? Like if you go to a dealership and buy a car, you cannot sign. California require wet signature for a lot of the contractual things. Like, you know, if you're buying a car, you leasing a loan, you have to sign that, right? Now things are changing because of COVID. We are doing a lot of stuff digitally, but there are things, companies are still putting out carbon copies of things and you have to sign it. Okay. So there are accidental things, and then things, they leave things, their system log in and walk away from it, going to the bathroom, and someone can actually use their system to access resources. And then also like USB, I didn't put it on there, but you know, downloading things, putting things on USB and taking it to work, and that could cause issues for us. So you can lock the port. All right, so let me flip to the notes real quick. Okay, so here you can find some of the information. You also have environmental threat and insecurity. We have to assess that. For us, this area, fire, right? Big thing. So if you have a data center, right, what can you do to prevent fire? Let me ask you that. What can you do to prevent fire? Should I put sprinkler system on the ceiling? Why not? Water and computer don't mix, right? What else? So you have to look at way to suppress fire, right? Outside and inside, because your data is money, like millions and millions of dollars sometimes. Think about stock exchange, right? What kind of data they have. So you can use halon system, but halon is not human friendly, right? Those are gas based, right? So when fire breaks out, it just, you know, it pours the gas. It's system friendly, but not human friendly. So you have to weight the risk in that, right? So now some company, they would use both. They would use some that's limited, like server room. There might be not that many technicians there, but in the regular, you can still use water on the system. It's just, you know, sometimes that can cause damage. Sometimes you can save those systems. So you have to weight the risk in that. And we have to do that too as part of our job. Okay. Internal threat, we talked about that. Man-made threats, right? Those are malicious with the intention. So somebody can go into your server room and just destroy all your equipment. That can happen, right? You've got to make sure you lock the server room. Okay. Intellectual property theft, that's a big thing right now for us. Copyright infringement, patents, trademark. This is companies' money, right? Boeing suffer from this because, you know, they lost their design and then somebody else created the jet for competitive edge. Okay, so other areas, the software, legacy system and platform, your old computers that store all the data, those are vulnerable. We don't put those online. We should archive all the file. Those applications are not continue to be patched or developed, but we want to make sure we isolate those systems. Okay, and then it talks about multi-party. This is when other contract parties are affected by the exposure. So if you're so let's say your company have contractors, right? People who supply you with equipment. And if you are being attacked because you're connecting to them, possible that they are being attacked. That's why supply chain is highly demanded right now, because it's well connected to everybody. So if they attack the right source, they can find their ways to other sources. So, you know, all right. Vulnerabilities, this is the areas that we need to address. So flaws and weaknesses in hardware and software, lack of updates, configurations, that's default, like your default password and username, like administrator with no password, lack of firewall, and organization policy. So let's come back. Let's come back to our assignment. Okay. So for number 5, the difference between environmental and man-made threat assessment, and you can give an example for each type. So environmental assessment evaluates the likelihood of a natural or man-made disaster occurring. Example, assessing California fire in the area of the business operation. And for us, that's a big thing. Earthquake is the second area that we deal with, right? So if your data center is only in California, you might be in trouble if there's an earthquake that break out or a fire that break out in the area. So this is why companies house data all over the world, like companies like Facebook and Google, right? Google actually put some of their stuff on chip and so on. So if you're looking at Amazon, they're everywhere in the world because these other sites creates backup of, you know, their main ones or their other locations in the United States. If you only have it in the United States, you want to have it across the coast. So if I function in California, my backup data, my data warehouse might also be not just in California, but also be in New York or New Jersey. I think New Jersey is a big area. But I can also put it in Canada and Mexico in the case where if something happened in the United States, right? So when we deal with natural disaster, a lot of times we have to think outside of our regional area. Your man-made assessment, it evaluates the human threats, the accidental and malicious, okay? People who are intentionally trying to cause damage or unintentionally trying to cause damage. and it happens quite a bit. Breach, sometimes people sell the data for money. Sometimes they accidentally leak a whole spreadsheet of information. Okay, so your job is to make sure that things don't happen. So we want to make sure that we filter. Email is like a good path for a lot of people to leak things. So we need to filter that. Okay. And train our people. And then we need to assess attackers breaching the network. So when you're doing the man-made assessment, when you assess the breach, possible breach is that's how you're gonna be able to prevent, because that's man-made. For two types of vulnerability, you can list, the ones that's found on the notes, but the common example is the lack of firewall rules. Okay, the configurations. And firewall, a lot of the times we deal with port, right? The number, the value that we use for the physical connection. And the protocol uses that port value or the port number to initiate services. For example, HTTP uses port 80. And if you block port 80, nobody can use HTTP. They have to use HTTPS, which uses port 443. So you can set your firewall to block or allow certain things. You can also, you need to do updates, right? We don't want to do auto updates, but we want to do updates. That means that you have to test the update before you roll the updates. Okay. So when Microsoft released periodic updates, we don't want to update everything, because updating sometimes can cause corruption to things, your applications, right? Because of various differences in the versions. So you need to make sure you test your update before you roll your updates. And then the primary goal in your risk management, when we're controlling your risk, is really to reduce it down to where we can accept it. Can we completely avoid a risk? Sometimes, but very rare. Okay. We have to weight the risk, like what I gave you an example earlier, right? If we decide on a fire suppression system, we have to really look at our risk, right? How much does it cost to replace 3 rooms in my facility if I'm using water system, right? Now, if we're looking at the system cost, it will be like $1,000, several $1,000, whatever. But the data inside the system also costs, because you have to rebuild those data if it's corrupted and not backed up. Okay, so that's your main goal, is to make sure that it's acceptable. Yep. Depending on the organization, most company only save it up to like 5 or 12 years, depending on the compliance requirement, the regulation. So most, like for your like Verizon, AT&T, all the wireless company, they say right now they're maintaining all your text messages for 3 years. But the laws might, if there are additional laws is passed, they're gonna have to save it up for 5 years. Yes. 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 So they can subpoena. So let's say that someone sent a text message to a hard killer, right? And it goes to court, this person gets caught. They will subpoena to your service provider, right? And your service provider responds even when the text is deleted. So first they confiscate on my smartphone from the arrested individual, right? They will investigate, and of course this person probably deleted and replaced, SDs and whatnot. Okay. But they go back to the internet service provider or the service provider, AT&T, Verizon, T-Mobile. They pull it from the data center, and it will have a full conversation. This is why when you're watching those prank shows, right, how do they know? A lot of time they pull stuff from the public, but when it gets subpoena, because it's a criminal case, right, things get discussed in court, becomes public.
Only through subpoena can I access it, or can I just call my mobile provider and ask them for it?
So a lot of times they only release it based on court order, but as a subscriber, you can ask for it, but they do take a long time to release it. So, the issue, there are ways, tools with software that we can recover like all your messages on your phone, your smartphone, like your iPhone, and yeah, SIM readers will you can put it into a SIM reader and it will, because memory are dynamically allocated, things don't get written over, right? A lot of the times you can actually access it still, especially with flash technology.
So that's it. So when someone recycles their old computers, their old phones and all that, and those companies, do you think, I mean,
Yeah, so you should zero everything out before you put it into the recycle bin. They just melt it out for gold or metal, but yes, they can pull stuff from your, you know, I've seen cases where people ran over their smartphone, right? Like a criminal got arrested in New York. He ran it over with his car. They took the phone back to the lab, and they have expensive equipment. They were able to still pull. Yeah, so encrypted conversations, sometimes they can access that too. NSA, you know, they can pull all this stuff. So yeah, you know, put it in the microwave. You see, yeah.
Can I see number 6, the beginning of number 6? Yeah, right there. Okay. Thank you so much.
Let me move some stuff up so you can see it all together. All right, so for 8, we are gonna look at some of the terms, right? So there are different types of risks that we would see. There's some things that will be inherent that comes with the company, right? There are things that are leftover, residual risk, and there are things that need to be aware of. So for 8, you need to identify the appropriate risk management terms based on the description. Senior management acknowledges the risks that exist and must address to mitigate them. Those are all. So when they acknowledge that, they would be aware of the risk. So that will be risk awareness, right? And top management level, that's what they're required to do, whether it's financial risk or overall operational risk, right? For us, operational risk impact us because every business use our systems. Okay, communication system or your computer or your devices. For B, CIO identifies the amount of risk that remains after managing and mitigating risk. So after you handle, right, you address the risk and it's still leftover risk. Those are residual risks. Okay, and we want for those to be a lot less. That's ideal, but sometimes it's not. For C, ABC Corp has risks that exist before the control are in place to manage the risk, and those are inherent risks. So that comes with the organization, and so even when before the control is in place, it's there. Okay. And sometimes that could be people. You can't get rid of them because they're valuable, right? People say everybody is replaceable. I argue otherwise. I've seen companies that kept people on, right, for a long time because they're either well connected or, you know, their skills cannot be found, right, or replaced. So they kept them on. Okay. And those people could be like, you know, they could be disgruntled and belligerent to other people, but they still keep them on. So sometimes, so when you implement control, sometimes, you know, that will take care of only somewhat of the risk. And then for the risk that exists, if the controls are not adequately managed, those are called the control risks. So even if you implement control and if it's not properly managed, it still exists. Those are called the control risks. At some point, you're going to see, cybersecurity is very close to business. So you're going to see a lot of the business aspect in it because the decision we made is really on the business side. So if the company cannot afford to implement control, right? Like let's say that I'm a very small company. I don't have money to buy firewall appliances or replace my systems or, you know, do a lot of the backup. I will need to accept the risk. Okay. It's like this, right? Let's say that they tell you that accidents happen every second on your street. But you really, really have to go somewhere, like your job, right? So you have to wait that. You're like, okay, I know the accident can happen every second on my street, right? But I have to make money to pay the bill, so I'm gonna accept that risk. I'm just gonna drive and I might get in a car accident, I might not, right? So companies operate that way. They're gonna say, you know, I might get hacked because, right, they say that every minute or so, some big organization get hacked. So if that happens to me, then I'll deal with it. But I just don't have the money or I don't have the resource to be able to prevent it. So I'll just accept it. Any question?
So we're out for risk, for security involved.
Yes. So before, so that's your goal, right? To really make it acceptable. And those are some of the techniques before we answer the next question. You can avoid the risk. So if I know accident happens on my street every second, I can just stay home and not drive forever, right? But that's not going to be the reality. So company can avoid it by not using the service or that product. They can transfer the risk, and this is where insurance companies come in, right? You know that now you can buy insurance for security, cybersecurity, very expensive now. I think it's gone up quite a bit. So you can transfer that risk. Or let's say that I contract with someone else, I outsource it. Right now it becomes 50% of the other based on my contract. So for example, I outsource it to AWS to store my data. I'm still responsible based on my contract, let's say 70%. But Amazon is going to be responsible for the security side for 30%. Okay, or I can buy insurance and then transfer that risk to the insurance company. So in the case I get breached, they pay me back, right? Because all it comes down to the dollar sometimes. You can mitigate the risk, you can accept the risk. Now in the risk assessment, okay, the first thing that you need to do is to identify your assets. Put the dollar to things, okay, including people, okay? And sometimes it will be like low, medium, or high, like qualify. Sometimes it's quantify. So the next question is really easy. Identify the things that you own, okay? For example, a car, right? Your car can be $20,000, $50,000, $10,000, $2,000, depends. Those are assets, okay? Some of you have stock, right? Crypto money, those are assets. They're not liquid assets, but they're assets. Your home can be, average home in California is not in the 200 anymore. You know that, right? Now, let's say you don't own a home. You own other things, your computer at home, your gaming computer, your laptop, things like that. That will be. So now assets don't remain the same price all the time, right? You have depreciation value. So as you use it, you lose some of the values, it loses some of your value. So your smartphone nowadays costs more than $500, you know. So those are assets. Now company would quantify that, right? How much it costs to replace that system or building or people, okay? So when you deal with people, there's more to just their salary, right? What kind of skills that they're contributing to the organization to make sure that the operations stay in place. So a manager, or let's say a developer, can have a salary of $100,000, but then the contribution in a project that needs to roll out more can be weighted higher. Okay, your cash or liquid assets, right? So what you have in your bank account or on hand, okay, most companies have cash as liquid assets. Okay, so that's the first thing that you need to do, is to identify your assets. Your building, right? Your equipment, people, resources. So before we answer the next one, let's talk about this. And if I don't finish this, we'll take care of it when we come back from spring break. Okay, so you have risk control assessment. That allows you to evaluate how effective a control is. If I put a firewall in there, right, and if it's not effective, it defeats the purpose of that firewall or the investment. So companies look at our equipment and our functionality as cybersecurity professional as the value based on risk assessment. So if I spend $70,000 on a firewall, it's better worth it, right? Every 5 years I have to replace or upgrade it. So risk control assessment assess how good that control is. If you put digital lock on your door, how effective is that? Now for the self-assessment, you ask the people to do that. Company surveys are really good at that, right? So if you put digital lock on the door, you can ask them, right? How effective is that? When they come in, do other people follow them? Do they give their code to someone else? So you can assess that, and that's part of your job, okay? Now, when you quantify your risk assessment, you need to put the dollar to the amount. Single loss expectancy is your SLE. So if somebody lost their smartphone that the company gave, that's the cost of their smartphone, right? But you also need to calculate how often that is. If 5 people lose it and it's $1,000, that's going to be 5 times $1,000. So that's $5,000 per year, right? And that can be costly. So you need to look at the occurrences and you need to really calculate that out to how much money you're losing every year. Okay, so let's do some quantification. Okay, so for 11, the type of risk assessment that's performed by your employees should be a risk control self-assessment. And that needs to be done annually. For 12, if the ABC Corp purchased 100 laptops for their marketing team, and the value of the laptop is $1,500, okay? And for a year, they lose 6 laptops. Okay, that's only 6%. Okay, so what is their annual loss? So if your single loss expectancy is $1,500, because that's one laptop that's lost, right? A single loss is a $1,500. In your annual rate of occurrence is 6. 6 people lose their laptop. So your annual loss expectancy each year, you would take $1,500 times 6, which makes the company lose $9,000. So every year they lose $9,000. If you're a small company, this can cost this is costly, right? $6,000 can go into something else. So how can you prevent that? You have to come up with a solution for this. How can I prevent employees from losing their laptop? So that means that they lose at least $9,000 per year. That's if, you know, so when you look at the overall, right, 9,000, so 6% is going to be like $9,000 for the company. Now, we're not counting the data that's on those laptops, only just the laptop themselves. You have to also quantify the data that goes on it. Okay. So data, we can control some of that. We can make it where it syncs to the cloud drive all the time and then back that up. So we can save some of the data that way. But hardware-wise, that can be costly. Yes. Tracking device, even when they disable the tracking device too, you know. So this is something that we probably have to eat. And we will just train the employees to make sure, right? We would use like, you know, something that they can lock down when they're working remotely, lock it to their desk, stuff like that to reduce it. I don't think we can omit it. Okay. All right. So the process of your risk assessment, we need to identify the related risk. We need to assess the risk based on assets. We need to make sure that we provide control recommendation. We need to take actions that would be correlated to the timeline. Okay. Why am I covering this? Because when you are a pen tester, you are a risk assessor. When you're an ethical hacker, you're a risk assessor. Okay. So you need to make sure that when you write your report, things like laptops get stolen or things like that also makes a report too. Okay. So when you write your report, you will write acceptable risk and unacceptable risk. And that's what you get the big bucks for. And sometimes it's network related, sometimes it's not. Sometimes just people leaving their door unlocked. When you have human factor, there will always be job for a cybersecurity professional because there's the human behind it. So people make mistakes. So when you analyze your organization risk, you have to list all the risks. Those are called risk registers. Okay. Then you put it into a graph or a table. Those are called risk matrix. They have templates for all of this everywhere. You don't have to start from scratch. You can look at examples. So in your master degree program, this is what you do, right? This is also what you do when you're a pen tester, okay? Because managers, they have to put together, the CIO, the CTOs, right? They have to create, a list of risk registers, the matrix. And then the heat map is just another visual aspect, but it's color coded. It's very much like the matrix, but it would be color coded. Green for acceptable risk, red for unacceptable risk. So when I teach bachelor level students, they have to put together documents like this for their final presentation before they graduate, right? They have to hack their way through a network and then put together a list of risks and then be able to do that. I think Cal State San Bernardino, they're doing that as well. Okay, supply chain. Supply chain means that all the elements and resources that it would take in order to operate business. So in the book, it talks about a donut shop, right? So I use a coffee shop example for you. Okay. Think of it like Starbucks. Let's say that they only sell coffee. Well, they have to source their beans. That means that they have to buy it from somewhere, right? They're a company that, either harvest or purchase it from overseas. They need to also get dairy products because for creamer and foam and all of the things that you put in your good coffee, right? Sugar, cups, cup holder, utensils, you name it. Everything that is used to be able to complete that operation. Okay. Machines to roast, refrigeration, brewer, all, you name it. Okay. So when we look at that, we would map it for us in security. We would map it to what system is connected, what kind of resources to employee. That means that they log into their accounts and terminals, point of sale system, and so on. So you have to list all of those things and then map it out to what kind of risk level that you're dealing with. Okay. Supply chain is big right now, right? So in the case where if we don't have milk product from one of the dairy farmers, what's going to happen? We can't sell coffee. You have to have an alternate solution. And then as supply chain uses a lot of industrial controllers for manufacturing. So if they get attacked, then we don't have our resources, then we can't sell coffee. So it's simple as that. Okay. A lot of the times now it's just like, how it is being interrupted. And why is this important? Because if your vendor is attacked, right, that causes business interruption. And it's simple as that. Okay. So if I attack a manufacturing plant, right, it will impact all these other businesses that using that particular product. You saw how that happens with the deal with toilet paper, right? They didn't have the pulp to make the toilet paper because the ship that was transferring those pulps from, I think, India was attacked, right? And so there was a delay in our side. All the United States company was suffering from that because they couldn't produce toilet paper by lacking the pulp. So, and you would have APT group that they look for specific target that is the main source to a lot of these things. Okay, things that we use. Okay, I have 8 minutes. We can do a few more questions. Okay. When assessing vulnerabilities, what do you need to evaluate? For you, right? You are going to be the security professional and pen testers or ethical hacker. You're going to look at policies and logs. You need to interview people because they will tell you the specific. Okay. You need to test your systems. And we have tools in place for us to look at configuration files and things, but those things needs to be in, those are some of the things that we need to address. I'm going to come back to 18. I'll answer number 19 and 20 because 18 you can mostly do on your own. Okay. So what are some of the tools that you need to assess vulnerability, right? We saw we can use Kane to look at weak passwords. So password cracker, that's one of them. And Kane is just one for Windows. Microsoft had a thing called Microsoft Baseline Analyzer. They discontinued the MBSA, but they actually converted to something else. It's pretty good. I guess you can assess weak passwords with a lot of the services that can be prone to attack. So Analyzer, has been used, and so you might still see administrators still use them. Microsoft just stopped releasing the newest one. I had there's another application that took place of it. You need to use network scanner like Wireshark to look for ports, operating system. I'm going to introduce you to ZenMap or Nmap. Okay, I think we did a little bit of Nmap a while back with Kali, but I'm going to show you how you can use the GUI to ping and look at your services. And then you can use a tool called Nessus. This is for compliance scanner. It looks at all your devices and connected systems, and it checks against a configuration configuration file that is ideal for regulation. Every business has to fulfill some form of regulation, one way or another. If I'm accepting credit cards or transactions, I have to fulfill regulation. I cannot disclose credit card information. I gotta make sure I retain the data for a certain amount of years. Even if I use a point of sale system from an entity like Costco, right? I still have to have that transaction recorded, like restaurants and things like that. Okay. And then, so there was a question last time. Is it legal to use some of the tools that I teach you? It is legal to use it on your own system, right? Computer Abuse Act, they have updated it since. So when it first came out was 1998. It was then updated in 2000. It's been updated. So anything that caused a harm to a system or circumventing a system, consider a Computer Abuse Act, and it's a crime. So whenever that you are doing anything and you want to be legitimate, make sure you follow the rules of engagement. Okay. These are the things. So on that document, it would say that you are allowed to do this. Okay. And it would set the boundary. So if I'm a pen tester and I'm getting into a network, but I'm able to see more, right? Let's say that they ask me to test their database. But in order to get to the database, I have to go to their web server, let's say. But I see more issues. My job as a pen tester cannot go beyond that boundary. Okay? It will only be for that database because I signed a contract saying that I'm only looking, even if I could see more things. Okay? And this is a gray area that a lot of people cross because they're like, oh, hey, I could do this and this and this, right? Because that makes that person. So that's the main difference. So this is a consent, okay? That so you can only specify, you can only assess a certain system that's on that document, that agreement. So your rules of engagement is important. You need to make sure that it's written and signed. That means that it makes it you an authorized pen tester. Because if it's not, you become the tester. Huh? Sometimes, right after that, you sign a non-disclosure, or before you sign a non-disclosure agreement, sometimes forever, sometimes. Oh, it's usually for a few days or months or whatever, how long your engagement will be. Okay, I have a couple minutes. So as you're writing this down, this is part of your notes. And when you read your notes, you can go back and refer to it. Okay. So Metasploit is a common exploitation framework. So when we say exploitation framework, it contains tools that you need to exploit. And that's part of the attack process. If you're doing web application, your W3AF is another one. Those are just the two that the book mentioned, but I want to show you something. I think I uploaded my PowerPoint. Any question with this? Okay. So this I created a while back, and then I reused it for my class. I should update it. But so this is what some of the ones that were common in 2019 was, and a lot of the reports that you read from research company, malware company, they will tell you what kind of exploit kits that they see. So in 2019, these are the popular one, right? Very different from what your book says. And if you do read a little bit into them, they have different objectives. So when you're using exploit kit, most of them are built for Linux systems. And so when you're using exploit kits, it basically you're having a set of tools and you can use those set of tools for various things. Okay, like Purple Fox, Cape Sand. And so when you work as a pen tester, not only that you need to understand the protective aspect, but you also need to understand the attack area. Okay. And then and you can find this. I wrote down like the step-by-step thing, and we can talk a little bit more about this later. Okay. As and I also hold on one second. Let me go to one more slide. So you have used Kali Linux. Okay, there are other OSs that you can consider. Some are harder to use than others. Okay, Kali is super easy to use. Parrot is another one that's one of my favorites too. Backbox, Samurai, Pen2. There are different versions of Linuxes that you can find. Some are better equipped than others, right? But most of the time, so Linux is going to be your best friend, okay? When you work in this world. Let me see. Okay, so we talked about the code of ethics already. Okay. So here are the rules. I always tell my students, don't hack your enemies, even though it seems like the right thing to do, right? We don't hack back because we're ethical hackers. We don't hack without written permission. We do not exceed our scope. We talked about rules of engagement. We don't hack friends or neighbors or people who we know. right? Even though for testing purposes, we report vulnerabilities and risks. And then if you do see an event, you can report to law enforcement, especially in this area. Okay. So now, the difference between, let me see. Ethical hacking and pen testing. I think a lot of students get confused about this. Ethical hacking focuses on looking at risk vulnerability. We touched on that today, and how we can secure the control for that system. It will target a certain area for defensive perspective. Ethical hacking is all the hacking techniques that's associated with computer attack. So beyond discovery. So when you become an ethical hacker, it's beyond pen testing. Understand? So people used to lump these things up, and it drives me crazy. So when you become an ethical hacker, your skill level is elevated. It needs to be, because you are looking at beyond what normal pen testing is. And I put this on a PDF. It's on your campus. Okay. And so it is beyond the hacking the system with the permission in order to safeguard the security. It's similar. So the umbrella of this is pen testing is right beneath ethical hacking. And so pen testing is one of the features of the ethical hacking. Okay. And if you want to, you can look at some of the cookbook that's out there by famous people who are ethical hackers. They wrote books, and they would have practiced it and so on. But yeah, I dug like really into some of the resources to really give you this, because a lot of the times people don't differentiate well in that. Okay, so take a look at this. I will see you Wednesday. We will finish up Team, and then I will introduce you to ZenMap, and then possibly a firewall rule option on Windows 10. And then next week, no class, spring break. Okay, I will not be here. But I will try to get your grades caught up this week. Okay, thank you very much. I think that my time's up. Get some snacks. See you all Wednesday. You're welcome.